Imagine opening your bank app and seeing more money than you've ever had in your life. Your investments are up, your house value has doubled, and your retirement account looks healthier than ever. On paper, you are richer than your parents ever were. Yet something feels wrong. Groceries cost more every month, rent keeps rising, and saving money feels harder than it should. Millions of people around the world are experiencing the same strange contradiction. The numbers say we are wealthier than ever, but everyday life feels more expensive and more fragile. So how can an entire society appear rich on paper while feeling broke in reality? This isn't simply bad budgeting or temporary inflation. It is a pattern that has repeated throughout financial history again and again. When you study economic systems long enough, certain warning signs appear before the illusion of prosperity begins to crack. And today, many of those warning signs are quietly showing up all around us. To understand how this paradox began, we have to look back at a major turning point in modern finance. For most of human history, wealth was something physical and tangible. Gold, land, livestock, crops, and resources defined prosperity. If you owned something real, you were wealthy. If you didn't, you weren't. But in the 20th century, the nature of money slowly transformed. One of the most important moments came in 1971, when the United States ended the gold standard. This decision quietly changed the global financial system. For the first time in modern history, money was no longer tied to a physical asset like gold. Currencies became what economists call fiat money, meaning their value was based largely on trust, government authority, and economic confidence, rather than a physical reserve. Once money became symbolic, rather than tangible, wealth could grow much faster than real production. Stock markets expanded rapidly. Real estate prices began climbing faster than incomes, and debt started playing a larger role in economic growth. On paper, countries and individuals looked richer than ever before. But many of those gains were not built on productivity or new resources. They were built on financial structures, credit expansion, and rising asset prices. The first warning sign of a rich on paper economy appears when asset prices rise much faster than wages. In many countries over the past few decades, the value of homes, stocks, and investments has increased dramatically while salaries have grown slowly. Housing prices in some major cities have multiplied several times over, while average incomes struggle to keep up. Homeowners appear wealthier because their property values increase, and investors see their portfolios grow rapidly. But for people whose wealth depends mostly on their income, life does not become easier. Instead, basic necessities become more difficult to afford. The numbers rise, but real financial security does not. The second warning sign emerges when debt becomes the primary engine of economic growth. Historically, economies expanded because of increased productivity, innovation, manufacturing, and trade. Factories produced goods, technology improved efficiency, and societies grew wealthier by creating more value. But modern financial systems rely heavily on borrowing. Governments borrow money to fund spending, corporations borrow to expand operations, and consumers borrow to buy homes, cars, and education. Borrowing can stimulate growth in the short term, but it introduces a hidden dependency. Debt must eventually be repaid or replaced with even more debt. Over time, economies can become dependent on constant credit expansion. Growth no longer comes primarily from production, it comes from increasing levels of borrowing. When that borrowing slows down, the system begins to feel pressure. The third warning sign appears when financial markets begin to detach from the real economy. In a balanced system, stock market performance reflects the productivity and profitability of businesses. But during periods of excessive financial expansion, markets can become driven more by speculation than fundamentals. Companies with limited profits suddenly achieve enormous valuations. Investors pour money into assets simply because prices are rising. History provides several clear examples. The stock market boom before the crash of 1929, the dot-com bubble around the year 2000, and the housing bubble that led to the financial crisis of 2008 all showed similar patterns. Each time, people believed the growth would continue indefinitely. Each time, reality eventually reasserted itself. The fourth warning sign is the gradual shrinking of the middle class. In a healthy economy, the middle class forms the backbone of society. These are people who can afford homes, education, savings, and relative stability. But when wealth grows mainly through assets like stocks and property, the benefits concentrate among those who already own those assets. Workers who rely on wages do not experience the same gains. Over time, economic inequality widens. A smaller group accumulates large amounts of wealth, while a larger group struggles to keep up with rising living costs. The result is a society where prosperity exists in financial statistics, but feels increasingly distant in everyday life. The fifth warning sign involves the growing role of money creation by central banks and governments. When economic slowdowns occur, policymakers often intervene to stabilize markets. They lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and spending. They inject liquidity into financial systems. In some cases, they purchase assets directly through programs designed to stimulate growth. These measures can prevent crises and support economic recovery, but they also have side effects. Increased liquidity tends to push asset prices higher, especially in stock and real estate markets. While this can make economies appear healthier on paper, it can also deepen the gap between financial wealth and real purchasing power. The sixth warning sign becomes visible in everyday life when essential goods and services become increasingly expensive. Housing, healthcare, education, and food costs often rise faster than official inflation statistics suggest. For ordinary families, these expenses consume a growing share of income. Even in economies with strong growth and rising markets, many people feel financial stress. The disconnect between economic headlines and daily experience creates frustration and confusion. People begin to sense that something in the system is not functioning as expected. The seventh and final warning sign is perhaps the most subtle, yet the most important. Modern financial systems rely heavily on confidence. Money has value because people believe it has value. Banks operate because depositors trust that their funds are safe. Markets function because investors believe prices reflect meaningful information about the future. Confidence is the invisible foundation holding the entire system together. As long as that confidence remains strong, the system can continue operating even with high debt and inflated asset prices. But when confidence begins to crack, changes can happen quickly. Financial crises, bank runs, and market crashes often start with a sudden loss of trust rather than a gradual decline. Throughout history, economies that appeared strong on the surface sometimes reached a breaking point when these warning signs accumulated. Governments and central banks attempted solutions such as lowering interest rates, increasing spending, or providing financial support to struggling institutions. Sometimes these measures stabilized the system temporarily. But if the underlying structural problems remained unresolved, the same pressures eventually returned. Today's global economy shows several parallels with these historical patterns. Global debt has climbed to levels never seen before. Housing affordability has become a serious issue in many major cities. Financial markets repeatedly reach new highs, while large segments of the population report financial insecurity. None of these trends alone guarantees a crisis. However, together they suggest that the modern economy may be experiencing the same structural tensions that have appeared in earlier financial cycles. There are three important lessons to take from this pattern. First, wealth measured on paper is not always the same as real economic strength. Rising asset prices can create the appearance of prosperity, while underlying economic stability weakens. Second, debt-driven growth can support expansion for long periods, but it introduces risks that accumulate over time. The more a system depends on borrowing to sustain growth, the more vulnerable it becomes when borrowing slows or interest rates rise. Third, The true health of an economy should be measured not just by stock markets or GDP numbers, but by whether ordinary people can achieve stable and dignified lives. Throughout history, financial systems have constantly evolved. Empires have risen and fallen, currencies have changed forms, and economic models have transformed. Yet one pattern appears again and again. When wealth becomes increasingly symbolic and detached from the real economy, societies eventually face pressure to correct the imbalance. Sometimes the adjustment happens gradually through reforms and policy changes. Other times it arrives suddenly through crises that force systems to reset. The real question may not be whether the warning signs exist. The real question is whether people recognize them early enough to understand what they mean. Because when an economy becomes rich on paper but fragile in reality, the numbers alone cannot tell the full story. And by the time the illusion becomes obvious to everyone, the turning point may already be underway. If you found this exploration valuable, consider subscribing for more deep dives into global finance, hidden economic systems, and the forces shaping the future of money.